My name is Brian Beach. I'm the tech lead for our next-gen developer experience community. Essentially, I work with a bunch of developers, customers, that are building on AWS. Traditionally, we've been focused on helping them with things like CI/CD solutions or infrastructure as code with CDK and CloudFormation, as well as all the SDKs and everything that you use. Of course, it should be pretty evident at this point that generative AI is changing everything. And so a lot of what I've been doing over the last 2 years now has been spending time with customers talking about first Code Whisperer and now Amazon Q Developer. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how we can use generative AI to help create secure applications. And this is an insanely short session. I only get 20 minutes up here. So I'm going to do a quick overview, use a couple slides to get things started, probably not even 5 minutes. And then what I want to do is go through a roughly 15-minute demo where we look at all the ways that generative AI can help a security engineer throughout their day and all the ways that they can use that to accelerate the things that they're doing. So before we do that, let's get going with just a couple of slides. I don't think I need to tell any of you this, but generative AI is a really big deal right now. These numbers are from Gartner. And they're saying 80% of enterprises will be adopting and building solutions using generative AI in the next 2 years. That seems probably really conservative, and I assume you feel the same way. I feel like everybody's talking about generative AI all the time, and everyone's building with it right now. That's been my experience anyway. And so AWS has been releasing a whole series of services and capabilities to help you with generative AI. Down at the very bottom of this stack, and I think of this as a stack building from very foundational components up to more focused solutions at the top. Down at the bottom, we have a whole series of GPUs that are available in different EC2 instances. Those are from NVIDIA, lots of other third parties, as well as our first-party offerings. And you can do anything you want down here. Right? I can host a model, I can build a model, I can train a model. But there's a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting. I've got to do a lot of work here. I've got to do things like secure, patch, manage my servers. And so last year, we released Bedrock, Amazon Bedrock. And this was a solution to make it really easy to host a model. You still had a lot of control, but it's really focused on hosting. So we didn't take the training side of it. We just focused on the hosting side. You could pick from many different models. You could pick your vector database, your embeddings model. You still had a lot of control, but you didn't have to worry about that undifferentiated heavy lifting. But there was still another layer that we wanted to build on top of this. And so at reInvent last year, the end of 2023, we rolled out Amazon Q. And there's really a whole bunch of different capabilities within Q. But these are the different things that we saw customers building on Bedrock and said, well, we could make this easy for them. Let's go build that solution so that it's reusable. And so I'm going to focus on two of the different Amazon Qs for this talk. I'm going to focus on Amazon Q Developer, which is what I spend all my time talking about, and Amazon Q Business. So Developer, I think, is self-explanatory. Right? This is a series of capabilities to help developers move and work faster. And it's not really just developers. We really are talking about all of IT and everyone that supports the developers, including security engineers and operations and everybody else that's involved. There's tools to help them. We'll spend most of the time talking about that in the demo, but I'm also going to touch on Amazon Q Business. And this is the ability to ingest your organization's knowledge, the things that are unique to you so that you can ask questions of it. Generally, you'd be doing things like maybe building a HR policy solution or travel policy that you can ask those questions. In the demos, what I'm going to focus on is more of the IT security policy and governance and the cloud center of excellence that everybody probably has and how we can enable that with generative AI. So I'll focus on these two capabilities. The other thing that I want to call out, last slide here, is we're building the Q capabilities into all the experiences where you touch AWS. So if you're in the documentation, Q is there to help you move through the docs faster so that you're not reading through thousands of pages of user guides. When you're in the console, Q is there to help you set up a service, show you how to do it. It's there to help troubleshoot when things go wrong. In the IDE, it's there to help you write code. It's there to help you find security issues and generally make you move faster. And we've also built it into a whole bunch of other experiences that you're probably using today within IT. So I think all of this is going to make a lot more sense when we jump in and go into a demo. And so for the rest of my time, what I want to do is, again, walk you through kind of a day in the life of a security engineer and all the different ways that generative AI and Amazon Q specifically can help them move faster. So for this scenario, I'll play the role of the security engineer. And let's assume that we are building an e-commerce application. And specifically, there's been a recent audit that's found issues with our ratings system. We've got some fake reviews that are skewing the system. And it's our job to go in and perform a security review and remediate this. And we'll assume that this is a TypeScript application running on ECS. We'll also assume that I'm not an expert in AWS. And so I have some learning to do there too, and we can look at how generative AI can help. So the first thing that I want to do is learn a little bit more about the situation, learn about the app as well as the issues that have been reported. And so I'm going to begin my journey in first with the audit findings and then jump into the Amazon Q business capabilities. So this is the audit finding report, right? Essentially, we're not properly validating product inputs. And as a result, we have these fake reviews. These are kind of misleading, and they're resulting in some trust that we're breaking with our customers. And so the auditors have made some recommendations about user authentication and content validation, even range validation. Make sure that, it's between actually 1 and 5 stars. So I'm going to come into the Cloud Center of Excellence. Again, this is Q Business. And I'm going to start asking it, have there been any other issues reported about this? And you can see, yes, in fact, there have. There's been issues with bad language, inappropriate images, and even some advertisements leaking into it for years. And we've been ignoring these. And if you look, all of this is coming from Jira. So Amazon Q has been crawling through all of my systems and learning this, so I don't have to go digging through all my old tickets to figure that out. I'm next going to ask, well, how does the authentication work in this application, in the product review application? And again, it comes back. This time it says, actually, it's not exposed to users. This is a trusted subsystem behind the scenes. And so we made the decision not to have authentication on it. In hindsight, probably a bad idea. And this time, if you look, this is coming from Confluence. So Q's been going through and crawling through Jira tickets, looking at Confluence. I can plug it into lots of other things like ServiceNow and GitHub and pull all of that information together into one place so that I can ask questions of it without having to go searching. So, in a few minutes, I've got a pretty good idea that we're in a pretty bad situation here. We've been neglecting a lot of things for years, and we're going to have a lot of work to do. The next thing I want to do is, I'm not an expert in AWS, so I want to go learn a little bit about AWS best practices. And if you started Googling that and started looking for AWS security best practices, you've probably found yourself where I did, which is in the Architecture Center, looking at best practices for security. And your reaction is probably a lot like mine, which is, wow, this is overwhelming. I was looking for a doc. I found a whole library of docs. I've got tens of thousands of pages likely to read to get through all of this. Wouldn't it be nice if I could make sense of this more quickly? And so again, Q is here in this experience as well. And I can come in and just start asking questions of it. Right? We've been asked to conduct a security review. Where should I get started? And it ponders that one for a second and comes back and says, oh, there's a few things you might want to look at. You can go look at the ECS user guide. There's a security best practices document. You could go look at your task definitions and sort of points me in the right direction. Again, all of these are coming with footnotes, so I know where to go read more. But I'm able, as a result of this, to go dig into the documentation much more quickly than I would be otherwise. And so I'm going to just keep going here. So one of the things that it suggested was container scanning. How would I do that? What's the solution to do that in AWS? I don't have to go digging to find that. It's pointing me in the right direction, saying, oh, ECR has a capability built in to go and scan your containers. So the next thing I'm going to do is let's go take the journey there. Let's follow its advice and jump into the console and go take a look at that experience here. So I'm going to move into the AWS console here, out of the documentation. And here I am in ECR. And we've got our ratings microservice here. And I'm going to dig in. And if we come look at the latest, you can see, not unsurprising at this point, the developers have been ignoring this too. And there's a whole bunch of findings in here. Some of these dating back into last year. There's one even from 2020. And a lot of these are not things that I'm actively using. These are just OS packages that I really don't care about. So I'm going to continue having this conversation with Q here. And just say, well, I've got all these findings against packages that I'm not using. How could I deal with this? What would you recommend? And it starts making some recommendations to prune that back a little bit and clean up. And then it also suggests that maybe I use a better image, a smaller one. And I can probe on that again and say, well, what image would you suggest? And it says, well, Amazon Linux is a good place to start. There's a nice lightweight image there. And if you read down at the bottom too, it also makes some non-Amazon recommendations and said you might want to consider Alpine. These are good places to start. So within just a few minutes of poking around, right, I've been able to substantially accelerate the experience of digging through my own internal systems. I've been able to move through the documentation much more quickly. And as I'm moving through the console experience, I'm able to do that much more quickly as well. So in these experiences, it's really all about just moving faster. The next thing I want to do, though, is I want to go and jump in and take a look at the code that I've inherited. Right, this is really where the crux of the application problem is that we're not validating inputs properly. And for this example, I've got an absurdly simple TypeScript project. This is Node.js using Express. There's two important files here. I've got the server open. This is just going to set up the server that this runs on, and the app that we'll look at in a minute where the actual API calls are made. So the first thing I want to do in here is I just simply want to run a security scan on this project. So I'm going to come in and say, I want to run a security scan. And that'll take it a little bit. It'll take a few seconds to go do that. I'll just clean up here. Let me hide some of these windows, make some room. And after a few seconds, it goes through and it's run a scan against my entire project, and it will come back with a bunch of findings here. Okay? So it found 11 problems in the project. You can see there's 10 of them in the app. Again, let me just get some stuff out of the way here so we can see. And let's start in the server. If we come in here, you can see it's reporting the first finding, which is I have a really big inbound payload. I'm allowing requests up to 4 meg, and it's just making a general recommendation. Hey, you might want to shrink this down. You're leaving yourself open to a denial of service attack. People could send some really big payloads in here. So it's making some nice recommendations just about the server to start. And then if we start to dig into the code, you see there's all these different log and SQL injection opportunities, right? So the developers here are logging the request as it comes in. That might be malicious, potentially, if someone knows what I'm doing. Or more likely, I might be just logging sensitive information that I shouldn't. It's also detecting some SQL issues here, where I've got some SQL injection. I'm just concatenating together parameters in here, and that's probably leaving me open. There's a bunch of other findings, but I also want to call out this quick hard-coded password one. Here, notice I had a hard-coded password. And when it has a finding, often it will make recommendations on how to fix it. So it's going to regenerate the code for me using generative AI and say, here's a solution. In this case, let's externalize that and pass it in as in an environment variable at runtime. So again, I'm not an AWS expert. So now that I've made that change, I don't actually know how to inject a password. I could go out and start Googling that, but I can also ask that question right here in this experience as well. How do I inject a password into an environment variable in ECS? And it goes again and ponders that and comes back with a bunch of recommendations. Secrets manager, parameter store, as well as some non-AWS, more generic solutions for how to accomplish that. And so really quickly, I'm able to find a whole series of issues in the code. It's offering me solutions using generative AI, and then I've also integrated all the documentation right here so I don't have to leave this experience to figure out how to address these issues. So with that done, I'll go clean up the rest of these issues behind the scenes. It's time to actually go and add some code to do some validation checks so that we can fix the issue that was originally reported. And I'm going to come back in. If you're paying attention here, you can see that I've cleaned up all the other issues, right? I've externalized the entire database configuration and fixed the SQL queries and stuff like that that were reported. So what I want to do now is I want to dig into this API, which is how you create a new request. This is the post for a new request. And I'm just going to start kind of ideating back and forth with it here, right? We'll do some threat analysis and have a conversation with Q and say, hey, can you make some recommendations on how I might improve this? And you can see it suggests range checking, just generally looking at user validation, all the same things that the auditor suggested, and it rewrote the code at the bottom. So I could steal that code that it rewrote. I want to be maybe a little more specific, though. And as I just go in here and start working, Q's also making recommendations to autocomplete. In the first case, it says, well, you're not even checking that these things exist. Let's make sure that the inputs actually exist and return an error if they don't. And then I'm just going to use a comment to quickly say, let's make sure that the rating is actually between 1 and 5, and we don't have people putting in 100-star ratings on things and skewing the system. And so it makes those recommendations. The second thing that the auditors and Q suggested was we're also allowing users to make multiple suggestions, or sorry, multiple ratings for the same product. We want to stop that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that insert statement. I'm going to ask Q to help me here and say, I'd like to convert this to an upsert. If somebody puts a review in for the same product again, I don't want to create a new review. I want to overwrite their old review. And so it helps me walk through the process of rewriting that SQL query. Right? In this case, it's saying you can use the on-duplicate key update clause, and that will, when something already exists, update it rather than doing a new insert. So within just a couple minutes of playing, we were able to write the range validation, rewrite the SQL query, and implement a lot of the things that the auditors were asking us to do, and Q's there helping me do that much more quickly. So then the last thing that I want to do here is there's really poor documentation. And as I took on this problem and was trying to understand this application that I inherited, I was wishing that the documentation were better. There's not even a README file. So the last thing that I want to do in the demo is I want to come in and generate a README file for this project. And of course, I could just create a README file and start working on it. I could use generative AI to help me fill in the gaps. But there's this other concept called an agent that I want to make sure you're aware of. And you can tell I'm using an agent because it starts with /. /dev is I want to invoke the software development agent, and I give it a pretty verbose description here. I want you to go and create a README file, and it's going to go off and do this in the background for me. And you saw that flip was me fast forwarding about 60 seconds. It's looked at my code base, and it comes back with this plan. It says, I'm going to add a new file called README. I'll start with a high-level description. And then it went through starting on step 4, and it found the individual APIs, 4, 5, 6, and 7, that exist in the project. And it says, I'm going to go document them for you. And I could ask for changes if I needed to. It looks pretty good, so I asked it to generate code. And again, fast forwarded about a minute there. And if you see, it went through then and generated the README file. And it's got the high-level description at the top. And then you can see the build-out of that first API. That's the one we were looking at a minute ago. It's the ability to submit a new request. And if you notice here, it's actually figured out what my request and response payload should look like. None of those were documented in the application. It just looked at the implementation and reverse engineered what the code should look like. So you're able to much more quickly generate things like documentation, unit tests, all of that. Also, these longer running agents are able to do quite a bit of work. They can see the entire project because they have time to run in the background for a few minutes, and they can actually touch multiple files. So if you want to add a new API and you need to touch a bunch of classes, the router, the model, the view, the controller, the unit test class, it can go and do that and touch half a dozen or a dozen files in order to add new capabilities. You're not limited to just one. So it's roughly what I want to cover, but there's a couple things that I couldn't quite squeeze into the demo that I want to make sure you know about as we wrap up. The first of these is another agent, one of these longer running behind the scenes agents like we were just doing, called Transform. And a big part of staying secure is making sure that you stay up to date and you don't end up falling behind and accumulating too much technical debt. Transformation helps you upgrade code either from an old language to a new or from an old framework to a new so that you're staying close to the cutting edge. Right? And it goes through and does a lot of the undifferentiated heavy lifting of upgrading your code base. Imagine in the Python world, going through all the Python 2 code, finding all the print statements and adding parentheses around them to get to Python 3. It was a painful waste of our time. Wouldn't it be great if we had an app to do that? That's what Transform does. Reference tracking, not quite security, but customers are very concerned about intellectual property when it comes to generative AI. The reference tracker will track that for you. And when it makes a suggestion, it will tell you, hey, this suggestion I'm making looks a lot like code that I was trained on. It's covered under the MIT license. Here's a link to it. You can decide if you want to incorporate it, and you can decide if you want to attribute this back to the original project. So it's keeping a log running of that so you know about all the times that it suggested something that looks like open source code. And then finally, customization. So I didn't have room to fit that into the demo, but these models are great. They're trained on a really broad section of publicly available stuff. They know nothing about what you're doing behind the scenes, the private libraries, SDKs that you've built. Customization allows you to point the tool at your Git repository and say, go learn this so that you can write this code too. And then it can help you with that as well. And with that, I am out of time. So thank you very much. I appreciate you spending 20 minutes with me. Hopefully you got a good sense of what we can do.